Welcome to Film Witch, a podcast with me, Sandy Settle, practicing pagan witch and tarot reader for over a decade, and a big fan of films. Here I talk about movies, their intersections with witchcraft and femininity, and whatever else I have on my mind, which is usually a lot. Blessed be. Come in and sit for a spell. And please, if you listen to this podcast and like it, read it and review it on Apple, follow me on YouTube and on Spotify, and share it with someone you think might enjoy it. It helps way more than you might realize, and it means everything to me. Watch for my Patreon, which will be going live soon. You can find me on Instagram at FilmWitchPod and on Letterboxd at FilmWitchPod. For our first episode, from 1998, directed by Griffin Dunn. Sally, Sandra Bullock, and Jillian, Nicole Kidman, are sisters who also happen to be witches. As girls, they were sent to live with their fabulous spinster aunts, Jet and Frances, iconic Stalker Channing and Diane Weist, when their dad died from a family curse. Any man who dares love an Owens woman is bound to end up 6 feet under, and their mom from grief. Years later, Sally's husband Michael dies of the same curse, and she moves back in with the aunts, now with her 2 daughters. Meanwhile, Jillian, ever a party girl, has gotten herself into hot water with a tall, dark, and handsome but very dangerous man named Jimmy Angelov. Sally tries to come to her aid, and together they drug Jimmy with belladonna, a sleep aid that is lethal in heavy doses, but they accidentally give him too much. Having accidentally murdered Jimmy and fearing they'll be arrested, Sally and Jillian cast a spell to resurrect him. His reanimated corpse tries to kill Jillian again, so they have to do away with him again and bury him in the aunt's backyard. But Jimmy doesn't want to stay dead. His spirit starts haunting them just as a detective, Officer Hallett, appears and starts asking all kinds of questions. My favorite witch film covers love, murder, magic, and all the shades between. So I really wanted to choose a film that I have loved for basically my entire adult life for this first episode of the podcast. And I thought, choosing my favorite witch film would probably be the best place to start, since this podcast is going to be dealing with witchcraft and its intersection with film foremost, but also, like I said in the intro, femininity. I identify as she, her. So femininity is in the forefront of my personality and my personhood, and it will definitely be an aspect of this podcast. But I want to encourage all witches of all walks of life, those identifying masculine or non-binary or wherever you are on the gender spectrum. This podcast is for you as well. I'm just going to be usually approaching it from my personal standpoint, but I'm planning on having guests as well, and hopefully I would love to hear their perspectives on witchcraft as well, or where they sit on the gender spectrum as it pertains to film. So hopefully I will have people from all different walks of life giving me their perspective on film and all the different shades of that. But I'm going to usually be coming from that perspective. So this is the film that I usually think of first, honestly, when it comes to both witchcraft and femininity and my love of film and where that began and how that intersects with my own personality and my own life and all the things that make me who I am. So the first film that came to mind, honestly, is Practical Magic. And I'm sure, like many people who have loved a certain film for a really long time, you have to really start to get down into the nitty-gritty of your own psyche as to why you really love something that you've loved for this long. Because, you change so much over time, especially as you're moving through your adulthood, that your reasons for loving something might change a lot, actually, as time goes on. But I hope that you guys will enjoy my personal perspective on this beloved film. One of the things that I listed first here in my notes is how well the film is known, specifically for the aunt's house. You find a lot of posts on Tumblr and on Twitter and different other places online about the house in this film and how its goals, basically, for not just witches, but probably a lot of people, all the childless cat ladies of the world. And I did a little research about the house because I had never really looked anything up about it before. The only thing that I remembered hearing in the past was that the house itself was just a facade. Unfortunately, that it was never actually like a true house that they built the interior of. The interiors were apparently shot on sound stages. As great as they look, there is no actual interior to the outside facade of that house as it's seen in the film. The facade, though, was built in the San Juan Islands off Washington State. I guess there's some islands around Washington State. I never knew that either, so that's interesting. As far as the town shots, all the cute little waterfront town stores and all of that, they were shot around Whidbey Island, which is also in Washington State. Though the film, as I always believed it was supposed to be, was meant to be set in New England. I always assumed they shot it in Massachusetts or in Connecticut or something. But yeah, it was actually all shot in Washington State. But it really feels like New England, so I feel like they did a really good job with that, making it feel specifically New England-y. If you've been to New England, it has a very specific vibe. And I think they do a really good job with that in the film. I mean, this is one of the reasons definitely why this film is so beloved, because the vibes are off the charts. The mood is really good. The set design, the locations that they shot at and everything. No other film about witches feels like this one, I think. I wish there were more. You know, you watch The Craft or whatever, and those have their own vibes. Those are cool films in their own ways, but they don't have quite this kind of whimsigoth Stevie Nicks vibe like this movie does. And that's definitely my brand of witchiness, I guess I would say. So it's definitely the one that resonates the most with me. And I know a lot of people online for sure, it resonates with them as well. But yeah, the house is kind of like this giant New England style mansion, but it's like a very rustic kind of vibe, and the interiors are all like built of wood, and everything is decorated with flowers and like these wispy kind of clothes that everybody wears, and long maxi dresses, and everybody has long flowing hair, and just has a very particular feminine mood to everything that's very rustic is the word that I always think of when I think of the vibe of this. But yeah, as far as for the Gen Zers, a whimsigoth is definitely the vibe of this one. You know, big pillar candles and sunset. It's definitely one of the things that makes this my favorite witch film. There's a lot of like really great production design in this film. I always admired the design of Sally's Botanical Bath and Body Shop. Everything's in kind of pastel muted green and like foresty green colors, and they're in white. Even like if you take the time to notice some of those scenes, like the design labels on the bottles, and she has like kind of like twine wrapped around things. Everything kind of has like this organic handmade vibe in there. And this movie came out in 1998. So you watch this and then you watch other films that came out during this time period. I just feel like this one, it's really got its own aura. And it's interesting, you know, was directed by a man. As feminine as this film feels, I think it's interesting, you know, how they were able to harness this mood. And you think about films, there's so many people that work on any given film. I always feel like it's a miracle when anything goes well with film, but something about all of this really clicked. But I'm going to get into some of the really interesting things about this film that I didn't know prior to doing some research for this particular episode, having to do with how the film turned out versus how it might have turned out, and the mood of the film, and how it turned out the way that it did. Still think it's kind of a miracle, but there's definitely a version of this film that nobody's ever seen that might potentially be extremely different from the one that we got, and I will talk about that in a little while. Back to the vibes of the film. Anybody who knows me in real life knows that I'm like the biggest Stevie Nicks and Fleetwood Mac fan, probably to the point of being fucking annoying about it. But the soundtrack has 2 different Stevie Nicks songs on it. And now that we know that there's going to be a sequel, I'm really, really hoping that she's going to do some songs for the new soundtrack as well. I just feel like it wouldn't be quite what it should be without her doing some songs. So yeah, let's put that energy out into the world and really hope that she's going to do some new songs or some covers or something, anything. Honestly, I would take anything for the sequel. There's also a really beautiful score for this film by Alan Silvestri. I feel like he's probably most well known for doing the soundtrack for Back to the Future, which a lot of people will probably know him from, but he also did the really beautiful soundtrack for this film. All I know is that there was another composer originally for this film, and that person, I think it was a man, I can't remember the name, they created a whole other soundtrack originally for this film, and then that soundtrack was deemed not right. and it was totally scrapped. And then they brought in Silvestri, which I think is so interesting. Like, I'm really curious to know what that other soundtrack was like and why it didn't work. You always wonder about stuff like that when you hear something like an entire film being scored and then the entire score being scrapped. And I know so much has to do with editing. When you're in the editing room, the film might turn out very differently than you originally thought it would. And maybe it was one of those cases, but for the cut that we got, the edit that we got of this film, I think the soundtrack is perfect. I know some people think it's like overdone or it's like cheesy in some way. I don't know. I think it's exactly what this edit of the film needed. And I think it's pretty much perfect. I've always loved it. It's a really beautiful soundtrack and very witchy, very whimsical and moody too. Because there's some very dark scenes in this film. I heard the other cut of the film is much darker, interestingly enough. But I think the cut that we got is also quite dark in its own way. So, another thing I wanted to mention was the Book of Shadows in this film. If you get a chance, and you're rewatching this, maybe try to pause it when they show the aunt's book, their Book of Shadows, as you call it in witchcraft, is basically just the witch's spell book. And it's just so gorgeous. It's like all like calligraphy and like collages and just super like that vibe of kind of like very dreamy, art-based femininity, just so beautiful. And there's like the scene where Sally angrily goes to the aunt's house after Michael dies and she asks them to resurrect him. She like grabs the book and then it like folds open from another side. It's almost like it has like hidden compartments in it. It's so cool. It's just this tiny little moment. And you're like, wow, wait, what was that? Like, it's just little details like that. It does so much to create the atmosphere of a film. I can't say that. I can't emphasize that enough. I think sometimes that a lot of films feel flat because they're lacking those tiny little contextual details that you really need to feel like there's a world there, right? A pre-existing world that you're being dropped into. And the vibe that the Book of Shadows gives in this film is just that the aunts have worked on it their entire lives, like most witches do, right? You add to that book over time, over the decades of your life, to kind of create a compendium of wisdom, of long-term knowledge that you are supposed to pass on to your, the line to come. And the book in this film definitely gives that vibe. It also has a lot of mystery to it, right? We don't get like a super close look at it. We just get flashes of it, which I also really like. It's not like, when you're watching Charmed and they're just like have very straightforward spells on every page, which I like that too. Don't get me wrong. I love Charmed, the original Charmed, but yeah, this is a different vibe for that book. It has a lot of like occult mystery to it. And I love that about the book as well. It's just beautifully made, and just those little details in the production design, like you can't do better than that when it comes to creating the world of your narrative. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Griffin Dunne. For those who don't know, he is probably most well known for some of his acting roles. He is the buddy who dies. I can't remember his name in that film. In An American Werewolf in London, John Landis's film, he is the one who is killed by the werewolf in basically the first act and keeps coming back as like more and more rotten and decayed. A lot of people know him really well from that film. He's great in that. He's also well known for After Hours, the film by Martin Scorsese. That's a really strange movie. I know a lot of people really love it though. I feel kind of ambivalent about it, but it's definitely a weird, interesting watch. So I would definitely recommend it just if you want to watch something that's like unique and strange. But he's pretty well known for that film as well these days. But he has directed just a couple films. This one is probably the film he is most well known for directing. I know he also did this movie in the 80s called Addicted to Love with Matthew Broderick and Meg Ryan. That is a really, really weird film. I don't necessarily recommend that one. It's basically like glorifying being a stalker. But yeah, he's directed a few movies at this point. This is definitely the one that most people know and love from the films that he's directed. But he is also known by some as being the nephew of Joan Didion. His sister is the older daughter in Poltergeist, who has a really tragic story. Actually, she was murdered by her boyfriend and the boyfriend got away with it. It's just a really horrible, awful story. But yeah, that was his sister. Weirdly enough, it's just odd that, there's that kind of relation, just weird Hollywood stuff. And he was a really good friend of Carrie Fisher's as well. I'm a huge Carrie Fisher fan. If you know me in real life, you've probably heard me talk about Bright Lights, the documentary about her and her mother, Debbie Reynolds, that I watched a million times. I recommend that to anybody. But yeah, there's a scene with him and her in that's absolutely hilarious, worth watching just for that scene alone. But yeah, he was really close friends with Carrie Fisher when she was alive. Interesting that he even got this film. I've read, several articles about him talking about directing this film, and all I really know is that he didn't, feel super drawn to the material personally, but he did feel drawn to the strong female characters in the story. He mentioned, being surrounded by strong women his entire life, basically, and that he could relate to that specifically and had recognized that, in the women in his own life, and kind of took that as his jumping off point for directing this film. I just think he did such an incredible job. It just feels... It's so interesting to think that a man directed this film. I don't know, it feels so feminine to me in so many ways. So he was definitely able to tap into his inner femininity, in a really strong way, I think, in order to be able to make the version of the film that was released. I know it's different than his director's cut, which he's talked about and we're getting to in a minute, but I think you have to be pretty in touch with your own femininity to be able to make something like this. So I really like that. I think it's really cool, and he's probably a cool dude in real life. I'm just going to say it's a good chance this is a cool dude to be able to make something like this. So this is based on a series of books by Alice Hoffman. At the time the film was made, there was only the first book. I've only read 2 of them personally. I've read this, and I've read the prequel called The Rules of Magic. Also a really good book about Jet and Francis, the aunts, when they were younger. The books are really good. Practical Magic, the book, is quite different from the film in a lot of ways. I think they're both really good in their own ways, and I like that they did something different with the film, honestly. But it's, it'd be interesting to see like that other cut of the film and see how similar that is to the book. But if you get a chance to read the books, I definitely recommend them. I haven't read the newer ones, but I do plan to read them at some point. I know they all deal with the Owens family in different generations, so I'm really curious to see, they're going to make a sequel now that's been greenlit officially, and I'm interested to see if they're going to base the sequel to the film on one of the books that Hoffman wrote, or if they're going to do their own thing. Either way, I think, it's cool. I'm excited either way, but yeah, it'll be interesting to see if it's based on Hoffman's material or if they end up going in a different direction with it. But Hoffman's a really good writer, and I definitely recommend the books. If you haven't had a chance to check those out, definitely think that it's worth it. The first book is definitely quite different in a lot of ways, but I really like it for, its own thing. It's been a while since I read it, but one of the things that I really like about the book that I also think that Dunn's original cut has, according to what I've read, is more time with Gillian and the narrative being split a little bit more evenly between Sally and Gillian. Growing up for a long time, I feel like I was, like in my 20s specifically, I was more of a Gillian. Now I'm probably more of a Sally, but I always related to Gillian a lot for a long time, for a long period of my life. And I think she definitely deserves, if I have any complaints about the cut that we got of this film, I think it would be cool if we had gotten a little bit more time with Gillian, more time spent on her story, because she ends up, I don't know, it's just like she ends up kind of just being a victim of domestic violence for a lot of the film, and that's like kind of it's not a super nuanced take on a woman's experience, within the context of like, how do you get stuck in a situation of domestic violence, like how does that even happen, and like someone not being defined entirely by that, I think is something that has been explored a lot more in film since then. But yeah, sometimes the film, the cut that we all got, the theatrical cut, a lot of time is spent on Sally and her love story. And, Gillian doesn't need a love story. She has one in the book. I don't think she necessarily needed one in the film, but there are other ways I think that they could have given her more screen time, just more character nuance and that kind of thing. So maybe if there's one thing that I would complain about with the film, maybe it would be that. And the book definitely has more time with her. So if you are a Gillian fan, like some of us, I definitely recommend reading the books. You'll get a lot more Gillian content in there. So yeah, I've mentioned a couple of times already, but there is a sequel that has been greenlit now I'm recording this in August of 2024. So yeah, there will be a sequel sometime in the next year or so. We don't really have a lot of information about that yet, but I know that Nicole Kidman definitely mentioned in an interview that it is definitely greenlit and that they're looking for a good script right now. That was the last that I heard. So I think there's a good chance that Griffin Dunn is going to come back to direct it. And like I said, it remains to be seen if it's going to be based on one of Hoffman's books or if they're going to do something totally different with it. But both Sandra Bullock and Nicole Kidman are greenlit to be in the new film. So I think it would be cool if they brought back the actresses who play Sally's daughters. One is Yvonne Rachel Wood. The other one, I don't know her name, but it'd be cool, I think, to bring both of them back as well. And then try to get the aunts back, Diane Weiss and Soccer Channing, if they're still, I don't know how much they're acting these days, but yeah, I think that would be really awesome. As many people from the original as they can. Because if I have, all right, I'm going to go off on a little mini tangent for a second. If I have one major complaint about Hocus Pocus 2, which I did enjoy, do not get me wrong, is that they didn't bring back the original kids for it, which I don't understand. I think Omri Katz and Vanessa Shaw and, I can't remember the girl's name, the little girl. I know they mentioned that they would have come back for that film and that they weren't asked, which I think is really bizarre. I definitely think they should have been brought back. I don't know. There's such a big part of the original film. It felt odd not to have them in there at some point, even just a cameo or something. So, I think the practical magic too would do well to try to get as many of the original cast members back as possible, especially since it's so centralized on the Owens family and the Owens sisters. I think it'd be really weird not to have most of them in there because the story is about them, not just about Sally and Jillian, but about them as a dynasty and generational witches and that kind of thing. That's a really strong part of the story. So I think it would be good. Try to get as many people back as you can is my personal preference. And I mean, if they're not going to go with Hoffman's book, I'd be really curious to see what direction they would take it instead. It's like I said, I think the generational aspect of this particular witch story is really important to what it's even talking about, what it's even saying, what its themes are, and it would be weird to kind of move away from that because that would kind of not be in the spirit, I think, of Hoffman's books or in the original film or anything. So I don't necessarily think that would be the right way to go. That's just my 2 cents. I mean, feel free to tell me what you guys think about what you think it should be and whether you think original cast members should return for sequels or if it doesn't really matter to you. I guess it probably depends on the film franchise for a lot of people, as far as what it would need, what it entails, as far as what you think would make it worth the while. So many sequels are being made now. It's there is an oversaturation point, but this one I'm really particularly excited about because I love this film, and there are other books and everything, so it's not weird to just make a sequel to this. Practical Magic is not the only story for the Owens as far as the source material goes, so it makes sense to me to make a sequel. It makes a lot more sense than making that weird sequel they made for The Craft. I don't know if anybody's watched that. I watched it, unfortunately. That's probably 2.5, 3-star film. It's not terrible. It's not good. They're definitely trying to do some kind of obnoxious, politically correct stuff in that film. I don't know. I'm certainly not against that by any means. I mean, I think inclusivity is vitally important in all things, but it just feels a little ham-fisted for that particular thing, and the only person from the original film who shows up is Fairuza Balk, shows up at the very end. It's in a mental institute. It's a weird film. I guess it's worth watching. If you're bored one day, put that one on. But I would say that's a good example of how not to do your sequel. It's really annoying too. Oh man, I just remembered something about that movie. Originally, the one who directed the film, the Fear Street, Lee Janiak was supposed to direct that originally, the Craft sequel. I remember I was so excited about that because I love her film called Honeymoon that came out before the Fear Street films. And I was such a big fan of that. And I would just kind of tote that film to everybody who would listen for a while. And I knew she was going to do something awesome next. And I was right. I'm glad that came to fruition and that was a legit thing that happened because the Fear Street movies are awesome. They're so fucking good. And I'm sure she's going to make something awesome after this. But yeah, for a while she was supposed to do that Craft sequel. And she didn't. So that's interesting. Anyway, it would have been good if she had directed it. So I wish she had. So back to Practical Magic. The cast is so good in this. I mean, everybody knows that Sandra Bullock and Nicole Kidman and the aunts, Stalker Channing and Diane Weist, and they're so incredible and so iconic in this. Probably just my favorite role that any of them have ever done. But one of the things that I really love about this film that I think is talked about a little bit less is the men in the film and the people who play them. There are three men in this film that are central to the narrative, and I think the film does an excellent job of juxtaposing different kinds of masculinity throughout the course of the film, kind of reflected in these three very different men. Jimmy, played by Goran Visinjic, I think he's Romanian or something in real life. I can't remember. But he is definitely the kind of man I think a lot of women are attracted to at some point in their lives. And I think in Jillian's story, I think a lot of women see themselves reflected in what is going on with her. I certainly do. And thinking about my own past, being attracted to certain kind of like alluring, dangerous men seems like something that a smart woman, I'm sure some people would say wouldn't do. But when you're young and you are looking for romantic experiences and looking for experiences in general, I think every woman at some point falls into this trap in varying degrees. Speaking about myself, I don't think I was ever trapped in a situation where it escalated to like true domestic violence the way that Jillian's situation does. But I definitely have more than once been involved with guys who just were not so great. And looking back, I think every person who has dated a toxic dude, you wonder why or how you got into that situation. But I think you see, I think he does this role really, really well, doing that kind of balancing act between being really sexy and attractive and kind of like dangerously seductive, and then kind of just on a dime flipping to being really scary, being really abusive, and being really menacing. I think he does a great job with that in this, because it's not you can't just make him menacing from the outset. That has to gradually come along, because I think that is a really true reflection of how women and people in general get into these situations to begin with, is that the person isn't behaving that way in the beginning. They call it love bombing, where they are showering with you with attention and everything, and just being basically like the perfect partner for a little while, right? And that's how you kind of get sucked into the situation. So I think they do a really good job in this with portraying the relationship that way, and making it clear why Jillian was drawn to this person in the first place. And Goran does a really, really good job with that in this film. The other two men who have major roles in the film are Michael, Sally's first husband, played by Mark Fairstein. And this guy kind of reminds me of like the sweeter version of Luke from Gilmore Girls, because everybody knows Luke, played by Scott Patterson in Gilmore Girls, is kind of grumpy. He's really well-intentioned and he's actually really sweet and everything, but yeah, he's kind of a grouch sometimes. This is like, Michael's kind of like the non-grumpy version of that. We don't get a lot of time with him, but I think what we do get established is that he was just a really genuinely sweet and protective and soft version of masculinity. It seems like he works at like the farmer's market downtown. He's just kind of like pushing apples and carts around and that kind of thing. You can immediately see why Sally was drawn to this person and ends up marrying this person and having 2 children with him, because just seems like a gentle soul. So I'm glad we get the kind of like sweet little interlude with Michael. I think that's an important kind of version of masculinity to highlight in the film, even if the man that she ends up with in Gary Aidan Quinn, it's a little bit more of an edge to him. I think he's kind of like the marriage between like something a little more exciting and also something gentle and masculinity. It's like kind of like a final destination for Sally, as far as, and in a way, juxtaposing her with Jillian, just a final destination for us, kind of a reflection of masculinity that we can finally land on in the end. And he has like a wholesome cowboy vibe, if Jimmy's like a dark cowboy vibe. So it, is narratively ties up really well. But yeah, I love the juxtaposition between the 3 different men in this film. I think is interesting as a meditation, especially if you're like a person who is attracted to men. I think it's nice to see kind of the spectrum of what, this is something that's on my mind a lot. And maybe it is even more lately because my husband and I just watched Fargo season 5. And I think that season of that show deals a lot with this, but just what is masculinity? What does it look like in different forms? What is like the dark side of masculinity? What is the positive side of masculinity? And there's a really strong meditation on that in that season of Fargo. And I think that this film, to a lighter extent, also has a lot of meditations on that and how it juxtaposes with femininity, which is definitely going to be a big part of this podcast. And my own experiences, just juxtaposing, my own kind of ideas about gender spectrum as they apply to me in my own life and my perception of myself and things like that. So definitely something I think it's fun to ruminate on when you rewatch this film. It's something I didn't start to think about until much later after I had seen the film a bunch of times. So, next time you watch it, kind of like think about the men in the film and the different representations of masculinity that they show and that kind of thing. So it's an interesting thing to think about. So next thing I want to talk about is the director's cut of this film that is apparently floating around out there somewhere. So for a long time, I think this wasn't common knowledge. I certainly didn't know about this cut of this film until very recently. So I found an article recently released from Collider, written by Haley Foch. And this is a quote from that article. According to co-writer Akiva Goldsman, the original cut was a darker, different, and stunningly beautiful, this part in quotations, take on the material. Yeah, super interesting. So a longer quote from that article by Goldsman says, I love Practical Magic. Practical Magic for me is also a movie where there was a different version, which weirdly in the same context we were discussing how the world has become more interested in this range of dark and light in the same narrative object, which I think is more recent, that you can have significance and depth and loss in fantasy or science fiction in ways that are more nuanced. There's a cut of Practical Magic before reshoots that Griffin put together that is stunningly beautiful. It was more 50-50 between Sandy and Nicole, and this hanging of Nicole was the counterpoint to this emergence of Sandy. It was more of a ghost story. It was really beautiful. It was weird. It got caught up in sort of a marketing thing at Warner Brothers as it moved forward in a way that I think didn't serve it ultimately. I fundamentally believe if HBO Max is able to play into the darkness a little more as well as the joy, I think that will be great. And that's Goldsman talking about the sequel, obviously. I also noticed a couple more articles have come out since I compiled my notes for this episode. One of them is they are mentioned that the sequel is definitely going to be based, at least partially, on Hoffman's books. They said they're going to try to be really faithful to the spirit of the story. There's a quote from Denise Denovi, who produced the first film. She said, the fans are going to be very pleased. We're going to be very faithful. We're cognizant to how important these characters are and the movie is to so many people. We're not going to reinvent the wheel. We're going to draw from Alice Hoffman's books. As the first movie did, we're going to be true to the chronology of how many years later it is. So that's really exciting. They're not 100% sure which characters are going to return at this point, but I am really happy that they're going to try to be faithful. That's always nice to hear, especially since this is just a film that is super beloved. That's really important, I think, to everybody. Wow, so much stuff has come out since I last did my notes. I didn't realize I just started Google searching and I found all this stuff. Anyway, there's one more thing that I found, that the second film is going to be based on Hoffman's sequel, The Book of Magic, which kind of picks up where we left off with Sally and Jillian later on. I haven't read that book, but I am going to read it now before this film comes out, just so I can kind of compare the two. Interesting, more quotes from Denovi. She said, the big mistake people make with sequels is a desire to reinvent the wheel and be totally original and surprise people because it's different. She goes on to say there's a joyousness to that first movie. There's beautiful themes of sisterhood and family and acceptance, tolerance, love, just the title that Alice Hoffman thought of that's now become part of the vernacular. Practical Magic is that there's magic in daily life and love and family and sisterhood. It's magical. We all have our gifts. Women have very particular and specific gifts. We really want to honor all of that. Yeah, I love that. She seems to have a really good handle on the themes of that first film and the first book. And they said in this article also, this is all articles from Collider, by the way, that they hope to be shooting the movie next year. So I'm guessing in 2025. That's really exciting. So yeah, they actually are going with the source material again, which I'm personally really happy with. You guys can share with me if you feel the same way or if you think they should have done something else. Or anyway, back to the director's cut of this film that apparently exists somewhere. That article by Haley Foch goes on to say that this longer cut, Dunn's kind of director's cut of this film that apparently existed at some point, will likely never materialize, as at the time it was unfinished. It's been over 25 years since this film was shot, which is, I know, hard to believe, but that is the case. Likely it's never going to see the light of day, as that film was a rough cut. But it's still really interesting to think about. And I think, reading those quotes by Denise Denovi and Akiva Goldsman about the sequel and kind of like juxtaposing it with the first film and the ways that the first film maybe falls short in the light of the present. I know a lot of people make that joke about the Owen's curse being, if you fall in love with a man, the man's going to die. And everyone always kind of makes the joke that, why didn't they just date women? Which is fair, definitely. It'll be interesting to see, how they kind of make points about the current landscape and the current definitions of femininity versus what they were in the late 90s. I think that's definitely something that they could find ways to explore with the new film. So we'll see what they do. It's really interesting, And you think about that quote from Goldsman about kind of like there being kind of a better balance between darkness and light in a lot of the narratives now, and the studios not being quite so shy to do that sort of thing, and knowing that there's an audience for that and that we'll embrace those nuances in narrative. It'll be really interesting to see what they do with this next film. I was ruminating kind of on the core of why I really love this film so much and why it's one of those films that I always go back to again and again. And for me, at its core, this is a film about love, the ways that it heals or the ways that it harms in the realms of romance, and also in family, familial love, and sisterly love. Domestic violence, death, being ostracized from society for perceived differences, living a normal life versus living an authentic life. I mean, even if you don't identify as a practitioner of the craft, I think you can relate to that sense of what is normalcy in an outwardly sense and what is living an authentic life personally, what is personally fulfilling to somebody. And I think, by the end, both the sisters are able to find a better marriage between the inward and the outward self and their true kind of like state of fulfillment. A lot of people see this film as a comfort film, and I think, the cut that we got is definitely the comfort film cut, and I can't be mad about that, because it's definitely become a comfort film for me. There is a lot going on under the surface still. I think, this time rewatching it for the podcast, I was definitely struck by how dark some of it is. And it's interesting, to hear that other cut of the film is apparently even darker, just because, like, some of the scenes, the domestic violence stuff in this is quite dark. I think as a younger person, I didn't quite get how sinister some of that stuff is. At that age, you don't really have the lexicon to really find language for that stuff, and you don't have any life experiences to mirror that in any way, hopefully. So it kind of goes over your head a little bit when you're younger. But yeah, I think that stuff is really well done in the film, and it is surprisingly dark. It'll be interesting to see, I have a 15-month-old, and she's not old enough to watch anything beyond Sesame Street and Bluey these days. But, when we do get to that point where I share these films with her, it'll be interesting to see, I think, what the conversations that I have with her are like and what her questions are about those things. I'm interested and curious to see what those conversations are going to be like with my own daughter, But I'm excited to have them, even if they are a little thorny, And I think a film like this it couches it in so much comfort. Like I was saying, it's actually a great space to explore dark themes. I think surrounded by kind of like the warm embrace of the craft, and the way that I want it to be in my own life and in my own practice day to day and that kind of thing. So. But all I can say is that I find myself returning to this film constantly. I watch it at least once a year. I always find something new in it. The design is so beautiful. The performances are so great. It has such comfort to it, but it also, deals with real darkness. And I think, there's something kind of for every mood. I always feel like the production design goes beyond the fantasy element. It creates a world that feels real and lived in. It anchors the magic in a plane that we recognize, the way that I think if you're a craft practitioner in your day-to-day life like I am, that's something that you are very used to, kind of like being able to anchor your magic in the day-to-day, and in, the plane of reality. I think this film does that really, really well. There's, a lot of fantastic kind of elements to it. But I think for the most part, these are witches that you recognize from real life. There's some funny scenes with like the townsfolk kind of like talking about all the rumors about the Owens and making like soap out of placentas and all this stuff that like it's basically just like remedies and things that witches would do for a long time, like healing women throughout the ages, herbal remedies and things like that. So it's great the way that it's kind of like anchoring all the different like witchcraft traditions or the different ideas of witchcraft into this narrative that's anchored in reality. I love that about this movie. I mentioned this a little bit before, but I've gone back and forth over time over who I relate to more. As a teen, I feel like I was a Sally. I was very shy. And I yearned to be liked the way that she kind of yearns for normalcy. But when I was in my 20s, like I was saying, I partied too much, got involved with wrong people sometimes. And at this point, I'm like very low key compared to my 20s. I live in the Pocono Mountains. I am married and I have a child, and we're working on our own small business. And, my life is like very slow compared to what it was in my 20s. Thank goddess. I'm so happy these days, happier than I was ever at any point in my past. And I think, a lot of women probably see themselves progress between being a Sally, then being a Jillian, then being a Sally again. And kind of, I think that's wonderful, and especially juxtaposed between sisters. I think, they probably see themselves in each other as well. And they're both defined in different ways, but both fleshed out, I think, so much, especially, due to the performances of Sandra Bullock and Nicole Kidman, making them seem like real women that you would know. I think it's just so well done. And I always thought, before I met my husband, that like so many women, I think, you hope that you would end up like the aunts. You would just be living with your best friend or with your sister in a beautiful house next to the ocean and just it's hawking spells to people. And I think, all of us still are hoping that we're going to have a house just like the aunt's house someday. That's like the dream home for, I think, a lot of people. And it's wonderful that it exists in this film. I think a lot of people wish that house really truly existed somewhere. They had made it into like a practical magic museum or something, and it would be a huge tourist spot. But alas, it's just a house that exists in our dreams. Maybe they'll build a real house for the sequel. I think that would be actually really well received if they just like build the house from scratch in Washington State where they shot the original one and then just left it there as a museum. I don't know if Akiva Goldsman or Denise Tenobi or Griffin Dunn, if you're listening to this, I think a lot of people would really love that. And it would bring probably a lot of tourism into that area, honestly. Isn't there like that town in the town that Twilight was set in? Now it's like a big tourist town for Twilight stuff or something. We could do that, the practical magic version of that. Anyway. So at the end of every episode, I'm going to be doing some kind of a spell, a short one that people can utilize. Usually going to have some kind of correlation with the film that I was talking about. That's just, we're weaving the witchcraft element into the podcast. So for this one, I have a house protection spell. Because this house deals so strongly with like a certain house and the certain protective element of the house, it has a kind of grounded, earthy magic to it. This is just a really straightforward house protection spell. It's one that I've utilized for many, many years. I lived in lots of different random apartments over the years, so, felt the need to constantly protect my house, my living space again and again. So, yeah, really straightforward spell. Just get a jar. It doesn't matter what kind of jar it is. And in the jar, you can mix 1 tablespoon of black salt. So black salt usually is made of ashes from fire, primarily. You can use charcoal. Also, you can use some kind of sand, sand is just basically ground up rocks. And you can use salt. But I will say, addendum to the salt thing, salt can be omitted if you're planning on putting any of this in grass or in soil. It's highly advised against to ever put salt into soil or into grass, or definitely not in plants or any growing things, anything, because it will kill whatever you put it into. So yeah, highly advise against putting salt in the earth. It's bad luck, first of all, and like I said, it will kill anything that is growing in that space. So I would say if you put salt in your black salt, you can call it black salt just because that's what it's usually called. It doesn't necessarily have to have salt in it, I will say. But if you do put actual salt in it, sprinkle it around the home, maybe on the doorstep a little bit. Do not sprinkle it in the grass or in soil. So yeah, 1 tablespoon of black salt. And then next, you just want to have 1 tablespoon of nettle, dried nettle. You can just order this online, or you can go to your local metaphysical shop. They can order it for you, or you can buy some from them if they already have it. Nettle is probably the most powerful exorcism herb out there, and so it has strong protective qualities because of that exorcism property. So it's getting rid of negative energy that's in the space, and will block any negative energy from being able to enter the space. So yeah, that one is probably my favorite cleansing / exorcism herb. Highly recommend. If you have no other herbs in your stock, that one is the one I would say make sure you have some of that all the time. And then the last part, 1 tablespoon, you can use either St. John's wort or you can use yarrow. You can omit these if you don't have them. I wouldn't say you have to buy them for this spell if you don't have them already. If you don't have either of those, just the nettle and the black salt will do just fine. Sprinkle it in all your doorways after you give it a good shake. I like to spread it around a little. You could use a paintbrush, you could use a broom, you can use your hand. Again, do not put salt in the earth, into the soil. Do not put it into the grass. It will kill the grass and it will prevent other things from being able to grow there. So you can recite a little bit of something if you want to. You don't have to. That's really up to you. I can give you a little something you could say. All who enter this home, spirit or corporal, must have goodwill. As I will it, so mote it be. That's all you really need to say. You could say a little something like, anything with ill intent must leave. I have said that before. You can add that in there. So any who enter this home, spirit or corporal, must have goodwill. Any with ill intent must leave. As I will it, so mote it be. And that's the spell. It's really just a straightforward protection spell. There's not really anything else you need to add to that. You can leave the stuff where it is. I recommend leaving it, so try to put it in a corner where nobody's going to get into it, that kind of thing if you're just doing it in the house. But yeah, really straightforward. House protection spell. Highly recommend doing that if you ever move, if you're in a new space. It'll go a long way. As an end note, will there ever be another witch film as perfect as Practical Magic? I don't know. But there are some things I know for certain. Always throw spilled salt over your left shoulder. Keep rosemary by your garden gate. Plant lavender for luck. And fall in love whenever you can. As above, so below. And peace out. Till next time. This podcast is produced by David Settle. He also made the music.